I think Brazil should be commended with the policies that you've undertaken over the last 20 years that began with Cardoso, continue with Lula, increasing education, increasing the Bolsa Familia, fight against hunger. You are really an example of a fight against inequality that worked. And you see it in the statistics. And it's really very surprising that in a short period of time, you can see the magnitude of the reduction in inequality. So it's a real achievement. The real question is, how do you continue that? Now, you mentioned one of the reasons for your success was that you got down unemployment. And that was the same thing as part of our success. And what worries me right now is that you are pushing policies of austerity, government cutbacks, that almost surely will increase unemployment and increase inequality. Now, there's one aspect of the Brazilian economy that I think needs to be examined in detail, and that is your financial sector. You're an exception. And not one maybe that you should be proud of. You have some very good institutions that have earned the respect of people all over the world. BNDES is one of the premier development banks everywhere. It's being used as a model of what others can imitate. The new development bank among the BRICS, the AIIB, all of these are using the BNDES as a role model. But your other part of your financial sector, particularly your private part of your financial sector, has the highest real interest rates in the world. The interest rates are stifling your economy and killing your budget. And taking away money that could be used for growth, for attacking inequality, for attacking so many of your problems. Let me go back to put this in a historical perspective, if I can, back to the United States at the end of World War II. Back at that time, the United States debt-GDP ratio was 130%. Now, that's probably more than twice the level in Brazil. And most people around the world would say, that's a disaster. We didn't take it as a disaster. We said, we're going to make this sustainable not by cutting back on government investments, but by increasing government investments, making GDP grow. So if you get GDP to grow, debt GDP goes down. And so we used that, we said, free education to everybody who fought in the war. Not just for 2 years, not just for 4 years, but as much education as they were qualified. Not in the poorest schools, but in the best schools, the most expensive schools, in Harvard and Columbia, free. Because we wanted our economy to grow and we wanted to give opportunity to everybody. We created a national highway program that knitted the country together, like the railroads had done in the middle of the 19th century. We created a technology program to make sure that we were the most advanced technology in the world. So the point of this is we didn't cut back, we spent. But part of that success in getting that debt GDP ratio down is we lowered interest rates. We didn't allow the government to pay the kind of outrageous interest rates that your government is paying on its debt.
Num capitalismo que o senhor mesmo disse que $1 é voto, os bancos no Brasil têm poder tremendo pela sua força econômica. Os governos ficam muito reféns desse poder, inclusive por conta de Congresso que depende do dinheiro dessas empresas para eleger os seus representantes. Como a gente pode reverter esse quadro dentro de uma democracia capitalista?
Well, that's the big question, and this is the struggle everywhere. We had a big struggle in the United States to regulate the banks, to stop the excesses of their predatory lending, their exploitation. It was a big fight, and we got a lot of civil engagement, a lot of people, and I would say we got a strong bill. Dodd-Frank passed in 2010. There was a balance of power between 300 million, 350 million Americans and 10 banks. It was basically equal, but we got something very strong. If you look back in our history, and you have your history, but in our history, there were two periods in the past where corporate interest got out of control, where inequality got out of control. And in both of those instances, American voters rose up and said, we are still a democracy, still. And they went to the polls, and the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century was followed by the progressive legislation, bipartisan, that antitrust, curtailing the power of the monopolies. It worked for a while. At the same time, after the Roaring '20s that brought on the stock market crash, the Great Depression, we passed Glass-Steagall. We passed the Wagner Act, which gave bargaining rights to workers. We passed Social Security that protected the elderly. So we changed the face of America. Now, the point is that when there is enough voter outrage and to say, look, there is no reason that Brazil should be different from every other market economy, mixed economy. Why are interest rates here so high? Why does the government have to pay?
É que como o Brasil fez uma moratória nos anos 80, ele perdeu a confiança dos mercados e hoje ele sempre vai precisar, está condenado por anos e anos a pagar uma taxa de juros alta. É um dos argumentos que existe, que é a coisa da confiança.
I think it's a self-serving argument, and there are several ways of answering this. I mean, if you change the rules and regulations, you change the way the financial market operates. If I were to say what has undermined trust in America, it's our financial system that brought on the global financial crisis. After the crisis, money flowed back to the United States. Why was the money flowing to the United States? Was it because they had trust in our banking system? No. Our banking system had proved itself incompetent in managing risk. Its only strength was exploitation of ordinary people, predatory lending, subprime lending, things like that. So why was the money moving back to the United States? Because they had trust in our government. And they knew that our government would support our financial system. So the basic thing is that you have to change the rules that oversee the banks. So for instance, if you required the banks to take more of their deposits and keep them on reserve, and those reserves be lent to the government, that would lower the cost of debt to the Brazilian government. That's a simple change of rules. Most countries require the banking system to keep very large reserves at the Federal Reserve or the central bank, and those money are then lent to the government, and at very low or zero interest rates. So that's a way the government raises money at very low interest rates. So what I want to say is it's about how you structure the rules of the game.
Eu queria perguntar uma outra coisa. Há 8 anos que a taxa de juros nos Estados Unidos está 0,25%. Parada, quase zero, abaixo da inflação. Eu acho isso aqui uma coisa formidável, principalmente para a realidade brasileira. O senhor acha que permanentemente tem uma pressão de que agora a economia está boa e é hora de subir a taxa de juros? Ou seja, o mercado está querendo fazer subir. O senhor acha que vai dar para resistir por muito tempo? O senhor acha que esse período, essa taxa de juros baixa foi favorável? Como é que o senhor vê isso?
There are 2 points that I make. First, going back to Brazilian interest rates compared to American interest rates, the fact that Brazilian interest rates are so high puts your firms at a competitive disadvantage with those everywhere else in the world. that you've done actually remarkably well given the disadvantage that your financial market has put at you. But you should recognize that something is wrong with your financial markets that puts the rest of your whole economy at such a disadvantage. The only part of your financial market that is working, in some sense, are the development banks, like the BNDES.
São o grande admirador do BNDES. Por quê?
They're lending at reasonable interest rates. Now, some people say they're subsidized. They're not subsidized. They're normal interest rates. They're the interest rates that any normal economy would be facing. So I wouldn't call them subsidized. I would put it somewhat differently. You're putting a tax on every business in this country that has to go through the private banking system. They're paying a very high tax for this very high interest rates that the private sector charges, but it's a tax that doesn't go for public purpose. It goes to the banks. So this is clearly a distortion. And I think there needs to be a public discussion about why is Brazil have the highest interest rates. And when I say interest rates, this is true even of the real interest rates. And just to make it clear the nature of the comparison, the T-bill rate in the United States, adjusted for inflation, has been minus 2%. So we have negative real interest rates, and you have very high positive real interest rate. It's an unlevel playing field.